Ford Pinto. Between 1971 and 1978, at least 27 people burned to death inside a Pinto after a low-speed rear-end hit ruptured the fuel tank. Ford recalled 1.5 million cars 7 years after its pre-production tests had shown the tank rupturing at 25 miles per hour. The fix sat on the engineer's desk before launch and cost $11 a car. In 1973, Ford drafted an internal memo titled "Fatalities Associated with Crash-Induced Fuel Leakage and Fires" that priced 180 burn deaths at $200,000 each against the $11 fix across 12.5 million vehicles. A tank of gas cost about $8. The fix was $11. Ford priced the burn deaths at $137 million. The math said, don't fix it. So a human life sat on the spreadsheet as line item 47. The Pinto's tank wasn't uniquely worse than other small cars of the era. The scandal wasn't the engineering. It was Ford writing the number down and choosing not to act on it. The gap between what Ford knew in 70 and admitted in 78 is the through line of every product on this list, measured in years, paid in bodies. Ford's Safety First magazine ads ran in the same issues that carried the burn stories a few pages later. Ford didn't lose because the car caught fire. Ford lost because someone typed the price of each body and filed it. Dalkon Shield IUD. Between 1971 and 1974, A.H. Robbins sold 2.8 million Dalkon Shields in the United States. At least 18 women died from the resulting septic abortions, and hundreds of thousands more suffered pelvic infections, infertility, and miscarriage. Robbins didn't formally recall the device until 1980. One of the victims was the product itself. The string anchoring the device, marketed as a safety feature, was the part that carried bacteria up into the uterus. In 1970, physician Hugh Davis published a study praising his own IUD without disclosing he co-owned the company that made it. A year later, A.H. Robbins bought that company and put the shield on the market. By 72, infections were piling up in the medical literature. By 74, Robbins was pulling it from U.S. sale at the FDA's request and quietly selling remaining stock overseas through 1975. People remember the Dalkon Shield as proof the FDA failed. The FDA couldn't have succeeded. Before 1976, the agency had no pre-market authority over medical devices at all. Regulating a uterus-puncturing IUD literally required Congress to pass a new law. The Dalkon Shield is the reason that law exists. Robbins filed for bankruptcy in '85 and set up a $2.3 billion trust for the victims. The inventor kept his royalties. GM ignition switches. Between 2004 and 2014, General Motors knew a defective ignition switch in the Chevy Cobalt and 10 other models could rotate out of the run position and shut off the engine, the airbags, and the power steering at highway speed. 124 people died in crashes the switch caused, and GM eventually pulled nearly 30 million cars. The fix was approved inside GM in 2005, and the engineer signed it off without changing the part number, so the company's own record system lost track of the fact that the part had ever been defective. That same year, 16-year-old Amber Rose hit a tree in Maryland in the first fatal crash. GM issued a technical service bulletin, not a recall. For the next 8 years, GM engineers and lawyers tracked dozens more fatal crashes, calling the silence the GM nod, a meeting-ending agreement to fix things nobody actually intended to fix. The recall arrived in February of 2014. 10 years. Long enough for a kid born in a Cobalt the year of the first death to be learning long division by the time the recall hit. GM's slogan that decade was engineering excellence, and it ran through the whole cover-up. The popular story is that GM hid a bad part. The Vioxx report found something worse. The bad part was easier to fix than the culture that let it keep moving. GM's gap wasn't 7 years, it was 10, and they measured it in compensation claims. Every one of the 124 deaths had a paper trail inside GM before it had a grave. Firestone Wilderness AT. Between 1996 and 2000, the tread on Firestone Wilderness AT tires kept peeling off the carcass on Ford Explorers in hot weather, and the Explorer would roll. The death toll passed 271. Bridgestone Firestone recalled 14.4 million tires in August of 2000. Ford had been replacing the same tires abroad since 1998. Ford's own data showed the tires were failing in hot climates. The US has hot climates. The US wasn't on the replacement list. Personal injury lawyers had been tracking the deaths since '96. By '98, Ford was quietly swapping tires in Saudi Arabia, in Venezuela, where 46 people had already died, in Malaysia, and in Thailand, without notifying US regulators. A Houston television investigation surfaced the domestic pattern in early 2000. NHTSA opened a probe in May. The mass recall came in August. 2 months later, Congress passed the TREAD Act, the only reason American automakers now have to tell American regulators about foreign recalls. 14.4 million tires is enough rubber to ring the planet, and that was the only legacy anyone wanted to give it. A federal law had to be written to force American companies to say to America what they were already telling Venezuela. Every file on this list tells the same story. The fix existed before the bodies did. Takata airbag inflators. The Takata airbag was supposed to save you in a crash. Some of them fired a shrapnel grenade into your face instead. At least 58 people in the US and another 35 overseas have been killed by metal fragments launched out of a defective Takata inflator, and 2,000 more have been injured. The recall now covers more than 100 million inflators across roughly 20 automakers, the largest in automotive history, and as of 2025, it's still expanding. Takata knew the inflators could rupture in 2003. The fix was to switch to a cheaper propellant that turned out to be more likely to explode. By 2008, internal Honda emails were discussing how to manipulate the data so the pattern wouldn't show. Honda finally acknowledged 13 deaths in 2013. Takata pleaded guilty to wire fraud in 2017, paid a $1 billion penalty, and filed for bankruptcy. In 2025, BMW issued yet another Takata-related recall, with roughly 14 million faulty inflators still on American roads. 100 million inflators is roughly one for every household in the United States, except the households don't all get one because many of them have 3. The propellant was ammonium nitrate. Farmers use it to blow up tree stumps. Takata's filings described its rupturing inflators as undergoing energetic disassembly. A lot of people assume the recall is over. It isn't. It's still the largest active recall in automotive history. Takata declared bankruptcy. The inflators didn't. If you find these kinds of corporate disasters worth a watch, I cover stories like this every week. I'd appreciate it if you hit subscribe. Thanks. Fisher-Price Rock-and-Play Sleeper. Fisher-Price sold 4.7 million infant sleepers between October of 2009 and April of 2019. By the time the company finally pulled it, the Rock-and-Play had been linked to at least 97 infant deaths. The American Academy of Pediatrics had been telling parents to put babies to sleep flat on their backs since 1992, 17 years before Fisher-Price put an incline sleeper on the market. Fisher-Price's own outside consultants had suggested the device be marketed as a soother, not a sleeper. Market research said sleeper sold better. The company went with the one that sold. Infant deaths started appearing in CPSC incident reports by 2012. Consumer Reports flagged the hazard in 2015, and by 2018, Fisher-Price was telling regulators it knew of 14 deaths. The recall arrived in April of 2019 and was re-announced in 2023 after at least 8 more babies died in unreturned units. Fisher-Price never consulted a pediatrician before launch, and its own internal reviewers didn't sign off on the device for sleep either. Some parents still believe the Rock-and-Play was pediatrician approved. No medical body ever endorsed it. Soother versus sleeper was a marketing A/B test, and the losing variant was the one with infants on the other end of it. 10 years, $200 million in revenue, 97 small coffins. Boeing 737 MAX. In October of 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 dove into the Java Sea, killing 189 people. In March of 2019, Ethiopian Airlines 302 went nose first into a field outside Addis Ababa, killing 157 more. Both planes were 737 MAX jets. Both crashed because a single faulty sensor told a flight control system called MCAS to push the nose toward the ground, and the pilots had never been told MCAS existed. 346 dead. A 20-month worldwide grounding. Boeing's own technical pilot had flagged MCAS as egregious 2 years before the first crash. In 2016, while building MCAS to compete with the Airbus 320neo, Boeing's chief technical pilot, Mark Faulkner, messaged a colleague that the system was running rampant in the sim. A few months later, Faulkner persuaded the FAA to drop MCAS from the pilot training manual. The FAA never saw the egregious message. By the time of Lion Air, 51 foreign regulators had grounded the MAX before the FAA did. 2 planes, 5 months apart, 346 people who boarded a flight they would never finish. Boeing marketed the MAX as so similar to the old 737 that pilots wouldn't need new training. The similarity was the selling point, so Boeing's engineers buried the one system that made it fly differently. The FAA had delegated certification of MCAS back to Boeing, the company being certified, which is the regulatory equivalent of grading your own homework. By 2019, the gap was no longer measured in years, it was measured in crash sites. By the time the public hears the warning, it has already been sitting in a filing cabinet for years. Johnson & Johnson baby powder. Between the late 1950s and 2020, Johnson & Johnson sold talcum powder that, by its own internal lab results, repeatedly came back contaminated with asbestos. Tens of thousands of ovarian cancer and mesothelioma lawsuits are now in the system, with $8 to $10 billion in settlements and reserves. The gap between the first internal asbestos finding and the end of US sales was about 65 years. 3 different labs in 3 different decades kept telling J&J the same thing. J&J told the FDA about none of them. Tremolite asbestos fibers turned up in J&J's Italian talc supplier in 57 and 58. In 69, a staff doctor warned executives in writing about the litigation exposure. Between 72 and 75, 3 more lab tests detected asbestos, one described in internal notes as rather high. In 1976, J&J told the FDA its talc was asbestos-free. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, the marketing kept selling purity. Reuters published the memo trail in 2018. J&J ended US sales in 2020 and global sales in 2023. 65 years is the gap. 65 years is also the entire modern shelf life of the product. J&J's line is that the science is disputed, and Reuters revealed nothing new. The court record says otherwise. Jury after jury has decided the memos were enough. For decades, the most photographed image of J&J baby powder was a newborn lost in a white cloud. The internal memos had said the cloud was the problem. The bottle still read pure. Pondimin and Redux, Wyatt's diet drug fenfluramine, taken alone or in combination with phentermine as fen-phen, scarred the heart valves of an estimated 30% of long-term users at peak. At least 175 people died, more than 50,000 sued, and the cumulative settlements ran roughly $21 billion, which puts it among the largest product liability payouts in US history. Wyatt's own medical director went on television when the drug was pulled and said the heart valve risk was new. His own file cabinet said otherwise. The FDA approved fenfluramine, branded Pondimin, in 1973. By the mid-90s, fen-phen was one of the top prescribed diet combinations in America, peaking at 18 million prescriptions in 1996. Internal YF memos in June of '94 had already proposed label changes for serious risks. The Mayo Clinic published 24 cases of valvular heart disease in July of '97. The FDA pulled in another 66 reports in August, and Wyeth withdrew the drugs on September 15th. Redux had been fast-tracked by the FDA in 1996 over the objections of an in-house safety officer, and it sold for 13 months before being yanked, which is the system being broken in real time on a 13-month deadline. $21 billion in settlements. Not a single Wyeth executive indicted. Vioxx. Merck's painkiller Vioxx was on the market for 5 years. By the most cited Lancet estimate, it caused roughly 88,000 heart attacks and an estimated 38,000 deaths in the United States before Merck pulled it in 2004. Merck ran the trial that proved Vioxx caused heart attacks. Merck also ran the marketing campaign that called it the breakthrough your heart deserves. The FDA approved Vioxx in 1999. The next month, Merck's own Vigor safety trial showed a heart event rate roughly double the older comparison drug. Merck published Vigor in 2000, framing the comparison drug as protective rather than Vioxx as harmful. The FDA forced cardiovascular warnings onto the label in 2001. In 2004, Merck's own follow-up trial, called Approve, showed the heart attack risk climbing sharply after 18 months on the drug. Merck withdrew Vioxx on September 30th of that year. At peak, Vioxx was being filled at 60,000 prescriptions a day. That works out to roughly 20 million patient years of exposure. 38,000 graves came out of it. Vioxx is sometimes remembered as a drug pulled out of an abundance of caution. It was not. It was pulled after a Merck-run trial produced numbers the company could no longer frame away. The drug pitched as safer than ibuprofen was, by Merck's own Vigor numbers, statistically more dangerous than the one it was supposed to replace. The gap, once measured in years, is now measured in gravestones. Merck's was 5 years long. 38,000 Americans died. Merck paid $4.85 billion. That works out to roughly $127,000 per body. If you want to see more stories like these, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.